I still remember the exact second my stomach dropped, even before anyone said a word. It was the way the room felt wrong. Too quiet, too prepared. Like a stage set for a scene I didn't audition for. I had walked into my childhood living room, thinking I was coming for a conversation, maybe a disagreement. Maybe another one of those vague, family check-ins my mom liked to have when she felt things slipping out of her control. Instead, it's felt like I'd walked into a verdict. My sister was already there. That alone should have warned me. She wasn't scrolling on her phone. She wasn't distracted. She was sitting upright, hands folded, calm in a way she never was. Calm like someone who already knew the ending. My mom stood near the window, not looking at me at first, smoothing imaginary wrinkles out of her blouse. That nervous habit she had when she was about to say something she'd rehearsed 100 times in her head. I remember thinking, why does this feel like an ambush? I sat down anyway. Because she's my mom. Because I trusted her. Because I had no idea that trust was about to be used against me. She didn't ease into it. No small talk. No, how's work? Even though work was my entire life. She took a breath and said, we've been talking. And not, I've made a decision. We've. That word split something open in me. I laughed softly, almost instinctively, waiting for her to finish the sentence in a way that made sense. Waiting for her to say something like, Ev, about the holidays, or about the house, sir, about your sister moving closer. Anything normal. Instead, she turned, finally looked me in the eyes, and said, your sister is going to take over the business. For a second, I genuinely thought I'd misheard her. Like maybe my brain was protecting me, editing reality on the fly. I asked her to repeat it. She did, slower this time. As if I were the one struggling to keep up. I looked at my sister. She didn't look back. She just smiled. Not a big smile. A contained one. Controlled. The kind of smile that says, I already won. I said, what are you talking about? That's when the papers came out. A neat stack. Tabs. Highlighted sections. Legal language. My company's name printed at the top like a slap across the face. My name was there too, scattered across pages in places I didn't remember signing, agreeing, consenting. Structures I'd trusted. Arrangements I'd believed were safeguards. All turned into doors I no longer had keys to. My mom slid them toward me with both hands, like she was offering condolences instead of taking my life's work. She said something about stability, about family legacy, about how my sister needed an opportunity. Then she said the sentence that still echoes in my head when everything goes quiet. You're too emotional to be running something this big. I felt heat rush to my face. Not anger at first, confusion. Disbelief. I had built that company from nothing. Late nights. Missed birthdays. Canceled vacations. Every dollar reinvested. Every mistake paid for personally. I had carried that weight quietly while everyone else enjoyed the benefits. And now, suddenly, I was too emotional. I wanted to scream. I wanted to pull out spreadsheets, timelines, proof. I wanted to remind her who paid for her roof repairs, her medical bills, my sister's gap year, her second one, and then the third. I wanted to ask why emotional had never been a problem when the checks cleared. But I didn't, because something in her eyes told me this wasn't a discussion. This was an execution. She had already justified it, already told herself a story where she was protecting the family, balancing things out, doing what was fair. And in that story, I wasn't the builder, I was the problem. I realized then how carefully this had been done. How long it must have taken. Conversations I wasn't part of. Decisions made in my absence. My trust used as leverage. My silence mistaken for weakness. The worst part wasn't losing the company in that moment. It was realizing how little my sacrifice mattered once it became inconvenient. I asked one question. Just one. Did you ever plan to tell me? My mom hesitated. That hesitation said everything. She said, "We didn't think you'd take it well." There it was again. My emotions. Always my emotions, never their betrayal. I stood up slowly. My legs felt strange. Like they didn't fully belong to me anymore. The room felt smaller, heavier, like the walls were leaning in to listen. My sister finally looked at me then. Her expression wasn't apologetic. It was relieved, like a burden had been lifted from her shoulders. I realized something else in that moment. They expected me to fight. They expected shouting, threats, legal warnings. They expected drama so they could point to it later and say, "See, this is why we did it." So I didn't give them that. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I just nodded. Once. Slowly. Like I was filing the moment away for later. Because something inside me shut down. Not in defeat. In clarity, I understood, with painful certainty, that this wasn't about business. It was about control. About favoritism dressed up as concern. About a mother who couldn't stand that one child no longer needed her, and another who had always depended on being chosen instead of earning. I walked toward the door. My mom called my name, suddenly emotional now that it was too late. She said we could figure it out together. She said, "You're still my child." I didn't turn around. Because children don't get robbed like that. I stepped outside into the cold air, and for the first time since I started building that empire, I felt completely untethered. No office to go back to, no title, no protection. Just the raw understanding that the people I trusted most had planned my removal with smiles on their faces. I sat in my car for a long time before starting the engine. My hands were shaking. My chest hurt in a way I didn't have words for yet. But under the shock, under the grief, something else was forming. A quiet, dangerous realization. If they could do this to me without warning, they had no idea who they had just created. The silence after I walked away was louder than anything they had said to me in that day. At first, I expected my phone to ring nonstop. I expected panic, explanations, maybe even apologies disguised as concern. Instead, there was nothing. Hours passed, then a day, then another. It felt like I had stepped off the edge of the world and discovered how quickly people adjust when you're no longer useful. The first night alone was the hardest. I sat in my apartment with the lights off, staring at my phone on the table, like it might suddenly come alive and prove that I still mattered. Every vibration was just a notification from an app. No messages. No, "Are you okay?" No, "We need to talk." It wasn't just that they took my company, they took my place. And the emptiness that followed felt intentional, like a punishment for not breaking down the way they expected. By the end of the first week, the financial reality hit me. Accounts I'd always had access to were suddenly restricted. Automatic payments failed. A subscription I didn't even remember signing up for sent me an insufficient funds email, and I stared at it longer than I should have. It wasn't about the money itself. It was about how fast stability can disappear when someone else controls the switch. I had gone from being the safety net to standing on thin air. I tried reaching out once. Just once. Not to argue, not to demand anything back. I texted my mom a simple, "Can we talk?" It showed as delivered, then read, and that was it. No reply. No explanation. That read receipt burned more than if she had blocked me outright. It was proof that the silence was a choice. Friends noticed something was wrong, but not enough to ask the real questions. They were careful with their words, like my situation was contagious. A few of them said things like, "I'm sure it'll work out," or "Family stuff is complicated," and then quickly changed the subject. I realized how uncomfortable people get when your story doesn't fit a clean narrative. There was no villain they wanted to name. No side they wanted to choose. so they chose distance. Meanwhile, I watched from the outside as my absence was filled. My sisters started posting online more than ever. Photos in my old office. Captions about new beginnings. And stepping into leadership. She wore confidence like it was always hers, like the years I spent building that place had never happened. People congratulated her. Investors commented with emojis and support. Some of them had shaken my hand, looked me in the eye, and told me they believed in me. Now they were cheering someone else, because belief is often just convenience in disguise. Every post felt like a small erasure, not just of my work, but of my existence in that story. It was like I had been edited out, rewritten as a footnote no one bothered to read. I stopped scrolling after a while because I could feel myself shrinking each time. But even when I didn't look, I imagined it. Her sitting at my desk, her using my phrases, her benefiting from relationships I had nurtured quietly for years. The isolation wasn't dramatic, it was slow and dull and constant. It was waking up and realizing I had nowhere I needed to be, no one expecting me, no role to play. My calendar, once packed weeks in advance, was empty. At first, that felt like relief. Then it felt like failure. I had tied so much of my identity to what I built that without it, I didn't know how to introduce myself to my own reflection. Nights were the worst. That's when the questions came. Over and over again. What did I miss? When did this start? How long had they been planning to remove me? I replayed old conversations with my mom, searching for cracks, for signs. Compliments that felt slightly forced. Questions about succession I brushed off. Comments about how family should share success. All of it took on a darker meaning in hindsight. It felt like realizing the house you grew up in had been slowly sinking, and you just never noticed. I thought about going public. About telling my side. About exposing what happened before they could fully rewrite it. But something stopped me every time. Fear, maybe. Or pride. Or the quiet hope that if I stayed calm, if I stayed dignified, they'd realize what they'd done and fix it. I didn't want revenge. I wanted acknowledgement. I wanted someone to say, this was wrong. That moment never came. Instead, the silence deepened. Weeks passed with no contact, no check-ins, no updates. I wasn't even included in the narrative anymore. I existed in a strange limbo where I had built something too big to forget, but not important enough to defend. The loneliness started changing me. I became quieter, more observant. I noticed how often people only value you for what you provide, not who you are. I noticed how conditional love can be when power and money are involved. And I noticed how easily people justify cruelty when they believe they're on the practical side of things. One afternoon, I ran into someone who used to work closely with me. They looked surprised to see me, almost uncomfortable. After some small talk, they said, "Things are different now." I asked what they meant. They hesitated, then said, "It's not the same without you." They lowered their voice when they said it, like it was something they weren't supposed to admit. That moment stayed with me longer than they probably realized. It was the first crack in the illusion. The first hint that my absence was felt, even if it wasn't acknowledged publicly. Still, no one reached out officially. No one crossed the line from observation to action, because doing that would require choosing truth over safety. By the end of the second month, I stopped waiting. The isolation had done its work. It stripped away my assumptions, my expectations, my need for validation from people who had already shown me who they were. I started to understand that being cut off wasn't an accident. It was strategy. Silence can be a weapon, and they were hoping it would make me small enough to disappear quietly. Instead, it gave me something I hadn't had in years. Clarity. In the absence of noise, I could finally hear my own thoughts, and one of them kept repeating, steady and calm, They may have taken the empire, but they didn't take the mind that built it. Survival didn't arrive all at once. It crept in slowly, disguised as routine, as small decisions made out of necessity rather than hope. I stopped waiting for things to return to normal, because I finally understood that normal was gone. There was no office to return to, no role waiting with my name on it. Every morning, I woke up and had to answer a question I'd never faced before. What do I do now, when the thing that defined me has been taken? At first, I avoided mirrors, not intentionally. I just didn't want to see the version of myself that existed without authority, without momentum. I had spent years being introduced as the founder, the leader, the one who built something from nothing. Now, introductions felt awkward. Conversations stalled when people asked what I was working on. I'd give vague answers. Consulting, exploring options. Words that sounded flexible but felt hollow. Each time I said them, it felt like erasing myself a little more. Money became something I had to think about again. That alone was humbling. I downsized everything: the apartment, the habits, the assumptions. I caught myself hesitating over small purchases, doing mental math I hadn't needed in years. It wasn't fear of poverty that shook me. It was the shock of realizing how quickly security disappears when it's built on access instead of ownership. I had been powerful, but not protected. There's a difference I learned too late. The days blended together. Without deadlines, time lost its edges. I filled it with motion at first, anything to avoid stillness. Long walks, endless workouts, late night drives with no destination. Stillness scared me because it made space for thoughts I wasn't ready to face. Thoughts like VAF, if I'm not the builder anymore? Who am I? If they could remove me so easily, was I ever as important as I thought? That was the most dangerous part of survival. The quiet erosion of identity. It doesn't announce itself. It just whispers doubts until they sound like facts. I started questioning my instincts, my judgment, even my memories. I wondered if I had been arrogant to believe the company was mine in more than name. I wondered if I had confused contribution with control. Those questions didn't come from truth. They came from loss. But loss is persuasive when you're alone with it long enough. There were moments I considered giving up entirely, not in a dramatic sense, just a slow retreat into something smaller, safer, less visible. A job where no one knew my past. A life where expectations were low and betrayal less likely because nothing valuable was at stake. The idea was tempting. Comfort often disguises itself as peace. But every time I imagined that future, something inside me resisted. Not loudly. Just enough to keep me from disappearing. What kept me going wasn't confidence. It was muscle memory. The habits I'd built while creating the empire didn't vanish when the empire did. I still woke up early. I still analyzed problems automatically. I still saw inefficiencies everywhere. I realized that while they had taken the structure, they hadn't taken the skill. The mind that built everything was still active, still restless, still alive. So I started small. Painfully small. Helping a friend refine a pitch. Advising someone on strategy. Offering insights without attaching my name or expecting recognition. At first, it felt like humiliation. Like I was shrinking myself to survive. But then something unexpected happened. People listened. They implemented what I suggested. And it worked. Results followed, quietly, consistently. No applause, no headlines. Just effectiveness. That's when I felt the shift. I stopped measuring my worth by visibility. I stopped craving acknowledgement from people who had already proven they wouldn't give it honestly. Survival wasn't about reclaiming status. It was about reclaiming trust in myself, piece by piece, decision by decision. I learned to sit with discomfort instead of running from it. I learned to let the grief exist without letting it define me. There were still bad days. Days when I'd hear my sister's name and feel something tighten in my chest. Days when I imagined them sitting in meetings I should have been leading, making decisions they didn't fully understand. But the anger changed, it burned cleaner, less desperate. It stopped being about what they took and started being about what they couldn't replicate. Because here's the truth no one tells you: when you lose everything, collapse can be clarifying. When the layers are stripped away, you're forced to confront what's actually yours. Not legally, not socially, but fundamentally. And what I found beneath the title, beneath the authority, beneath the external validation, was someone who could adapt, someone who could rebuild, someone who didn't need permission to create value. I began to see the betrayal differently, not as the end of my story, but as a brutal interruption that revealed who was only loyal to my position and who might respect my ability. Most people fell into the first category. A few surprised me. Those few mattered more than I ever admitted before. The identity collapse wasn't instant recovery. It was reconstruction. I had to mourn the version of myself that believed hard work guaranteed fairness. That family meant safety. That loyalty was mutual by default. Letting go of those beliefs hurt more than losing money ever could. But once they were gone, I felt lighter. Less naïve. More grounded. Survival taught me something else too. Independence isn't just about income. It's about emotional autonomy. It's about not handing your sense of self to people who can revoke it when it's convenient. I stopped seeking closure from my mom. I stopped hoping for accountability from my sister. Closure is a gift you give yourself when you realize the explanation will never be enough. By the time I looked back at those first months, I barely recognized the person who had walked out of that living room shaking and silent. Not because the pain was gone, but because it had changed shape. It no longer controlled me. It informed me. I hadn't rebuilt an empire yet, but I had rebuilt something far more dangerous. Myself. The realization didn't arrive as a dramatic revelation. There was no single phone call, no explosive email, no moment where everything suddenly made sense. It unfolded quietly in fragments, like a picture slowly coming into focus the longer you stare at it. At first, I resisted it. I didn't want to believe that the thing I had poured my life into was unraveling without me. Not out of pride, but out of fear. Because if it was failing, it meant everything I'd warned myself not to think was true. It started with small, almost insignificant signals. A former vendor casually mentioned delays in payments. A client I used to handle personally reached out. Just to check in, their tone polite but uncertain. Someone else asked if I was still involved, in a way that told me they already knew the answer, but were hoping I'd say yes anyway. These weren't complaints. They were probes. People testing the stability of something that suddenly felt less solid. At first, I dismissed it. I told myself transitions are messy. Leadership changes take time. Any organization would stumble after a shift like that. I didn't want to read too much into it, partly because I didn't want to feel vindicated. Vindication felt too close to bitterness, and bitterness was something I was actively trying not to become. So I stayed quiet. I observed. I listened more than I spoke. But the signals didn't stop. They multiplied. People who had once deferred to me started asking questions that revealed gaps. Not maliciously. Almost apologetically. Questions about processes I had built from scratch. Decisions that lived in my head, because no one else had ever needed to make them. I realized how much of the operation had depended on context, intuition, and relationships rather than documentation. Not because I was careless, but because I was present. I was the connective tissue. I filled in the spaces before they became problems. Without me, those spaces were widening. The most unsettling part was how predictable it all was. I could see the chain reactions forming before they fully happened. A delayed decision here would cause a missed opportunity there. A misread relationship would quietly sour a partnership. The wrong tone in a meeting would erode trust that took years to build. I had spent so long inside the system that I knew its weaknesses as well as its strengths. And now I was watching those weaknesses surface in real time. That's when the realization sharpened into something undeniable. They hadn't taken over a machine. They had taken over a living system. And they didn't know how to keep it alive. I began hearing about internal tension, employees unsure who to listen to, decisions being made by committee instead of clarity, confidence replacing competence. My sister, suddenly in a role she'd never earned, trying to assert authority through optics rather than understanding. Long meetings with little resolution, strategies that sounded impressive but lacked execution. All the surface level markers of leadership without the substance. What struck me most was how quickly the culture changed. The sense of urgency I had cultivated faded. Accountability blurred. People stopped pushing back, not because they agreed, but because they no longer trusted that dissent would lead to improvement. When leadership feels temporary or performative, people conserve energy. They stop caring deeply. And once that happens, decline is only a matter of time. I didn't celebrate any of this. There was no satisfaction in being right. Watching something you love deteriorate is a strange kind of grief. Even after everything that happened, a part of me still felt responsible. Not legally, not officially, but emotionally, I had built that place to function with integrity. And seeing it drift felt like watching a child make choices you know will hurt them, while being powerless to intervene. Then came the realization that cut deepest. They didn't even fully understand what they had taken from me. They thought they had taken ownership, but what they had taken was exposure. Every decision now carried risk they couldn't anticipate. Every relationship required maintenance they didn't know how to provide. They were standing on top of something that looked solid from the outside, but was already cracking underneath their feet. And the worst part, they didn't see it yet. Arrogance has a way of delaying awareness until consequences become unavoidable. That's when the calls began to shift in tone, less confident, more cautious, questions disguised as updates that were really requests for reassurance. People stopped saying, "Here's what we're doing," and started saying, "What do you think?" I answered carefully. I didn't overstep. I didn't insert myself where I wasn't invited. But each conversation confirmed what I already knew. The foundation wasn't gone. It had been removed, and now everything built on top of it was struggling to stay upright. I realized then that leadership isn't about being replaceable. Anyone can be replaced. Leadership is about being replicated, and I hadn't been. Not because I refused to teach, but because no one thought they needed to learn from me until I was gone. They assumed the system would run itself, that the momentum would carry on, that my presence had been optional. It wasn't, and that truth was starting to surface in ways no amount of branding or denial could hide. There was a moment, late one evening, when I sat alone and felt something unexpected. Not anger, not grief, relief. The quiet relief of finally understanding that the collapse wasn't a reflection of my failure. It was a reflection of my impact. The very problems they were now facing were the problems I had spent years preventing. The realization changed how I saw everything. I stopped wondering if I had been wronged. I stopped questioning my value. I stopped replaying the betrayal in my head, because the evidence was unfolding without my involvement. Reality was doing the work I had been tempted to do myself. They were exposed, not by me, by the absence of what I used to quietly carry. And for the first time since I walked away, I understood something with absolute clarity. I wasn't removed because I was weak. I was removed because I was essential. By the time the call finally came, I wasn't waiting for it anymore. That's what surprised me most. There had been a stretch where I checked my phone obsessively, where every unknown number made my chest tighten, where I imagined a dozen different versions of what they might say if they ever reached out. Apologies, explanations, excuses. By then, I had lived through all of those conversations in my head so many times that when reality finally arrived, it felt almost distant. The phone rang on an ordinary afternoon. No dramatic timing, no build-up, just a vibration on the table while I was in the middle of something else. I remember staring at the screen and feeling calm. The name on the caller ID didn't spike my heart rate. It didn't fill me with dread or hope. It just confirmed what I already knew was coming. I let it ring. Not to punish them. Not to make a point. I just needed to know whether I was choosing to answer or reacting out of old habits. For years I had been conditioned to respond immediately. To fix. To stabilize, to step in when things wobbled. That instinct had been used against me. I wasn't going to let it control me again. They left a voicemail. My mom's voice sounded different. Tired. Careful. The confidence she always carried when she believed she was in control was gone. She spoke slowly, like she was weighing every word. She said they just wanted to talk. That things had become complicated. That maybe they hadn't realized how much I was handling. She didn't apologize. Not directly. But there was something fragile in her tone that hadn't been there before. I didn't call back right away. That night, I listened to the voicemail again, then again, not because I needed to analyze it, but because I wanted to understand how it made me feel. And what I felt wasn't satisfaction. It wasn't triumph, it was sadness. Deep, hollow sadness for the version of her who had convinced herself that removing me was necessary, and for the version of me who had believed loyalty would protect me. The second call came the next day. Then a text, short, polite, almost formal. Please, we need your perspective. That word stood out. Perspective. Not forgiveness. Not reconciliation. Utility. They were reaching out not because they missed me, but because they were lost. And that's when the weight of the moment really hit me. For the first time since the betrayal, the balance had shifted. They weren't calling from a position of authority. They were calling from uncertainty. The empire they had so confidently taken was no longer holding its shape, and now they were feeling the consequences of removing the person who knew how to hold it together. When I finally agreed to talk, it was on my terms. Neutral ground, no family home, no familiar power dynamics, just a quiet place where I could leave whenever I wanted. That alone felt like a small victory, not over them, but over the version of myself that would have folded just to restore peace. They arrived before me. Both of them. Sitting side by side. When I walked in, they looked up like people bracing for impact. My sister tried to smile. It didn't land. My mom stood up too quickly, then sat back down, unsure of herself in a way I had never seen before. The conversation started carefully. Updates framed as explanations. Explanations framed as misunderstandings. They talked about challenges, about resistance, about how things just haven't been the same. They avoided the word mistake, avoided the word betrayal, but they circled the truth so closely that it hung in the air between us. Finally, my mom said it. We didn't realize how much you did. There it was. Not an apology. Not accountability. But acknowledgement. And as incomplete as it was, I could feel how hard it was for her to say. Admitting that meant admitting that the decision to remove me hadn't been about my limitations. It had been about her misjudgment. I asked one question, the only one that mattered. Why now? They exchanged a look. My sister looked down. My mom hesitated, then exhaled like she had been holding her breath for months. because we can't fix this without you." The words landed heavier than any insult ever had. In that moment, I saw everything clearly. The power they thought they had. The control they assumed would last. The illusion that replacing me would be simple because my role looked simple from the outside. They hadn't missed me as a person. They had missed the results, the stability, the invisible work that prevented chaos. And I realized something else too. If I stepped back in now, nothing would change. Not the dynamics, not the respect, not the underlying belief that I was replaceable until proven otherwise. They didn't want reconciliation. They wanted rescue. I told them the truth. Calmly. Without anger, I said I was building something new. Something that didn't rely on shared control or emotional leverage. I said I hoped they found a way forward, but it wouldn't involve me fixing what I had been pushed out of. I didn't say it to punish them. I said it because it was the first time I had ever chosen myself without apology. My mom's eyes filled with tears. My sister finally looked at me then. Really looked at me. Like she was seeing me for the first time, not as competition, not as a resource, but as someone who had moved beyond her reach. They asked if I would reconsider. I didn't answer right away. Because the truth was, I already had. The answer just wasn't what they wanted. I stood up, thanked them for being honest, even if it came late. And I left. No dramatic exit, no final speech. Just a quiet ending to a chapter that had already closed for me internally. As I walked away, my phone buzzed again. Another message. Another attempt to keep the door open. I didn't respond, because crawling back only works when the person you wronged is still standing in the same place you left them. And I wasn't. Walking away that day felt different from every other departure I had ever made. There was no adrenaline, no shaking hands, no knot in my chest. Just a strange, steady calm, like I had finally stepped into alignment with something I'd been resisting for a long time. For years, I had been chasing approval without calling it that. Approval from my mom. Approval from my family. Approval from a version of success that rewarded sacrifice but never questioned who benefited from it. Leaving that table wasn't just leaving them. It was leaving an old identity behind. I didn't announce what I was building next. I didn't post about it. I didn't hint at it in conversations. I worked quietly, the way I always had in the beginning, before there was anything to prove. The difference now was intention. Every decision came with a question I hadn't asked before. Does this protect my autonomy? If the answer was no, I walked away. No matter how tempting the opportunity looked. The new venture started smaller, but it felt stronger. Not because it was flawless, but because it was mine in every sense that mattered. No emotional debts. No blurred boundaries disguised as family loyalty. Every agreement was clear. Every partnership was chosen, not inherited. I didn't build it to impress anyone. I built it to last. What surprised me most was how much lighter I felt without the constant need to be understood. I stopped explaining my past. Stopped correcting the narrative when people got it wrong. The truth didn't need my defense anymore. The results would speak in time, and I was patient enough now to let them. Every so often, I'd hear updates. Through mutual contacts, through passing comments, the old empire never fully recovered. They stabilized pieces of it, reshuffled leadership, brought in consultants. It survived, technically, but it never regained its momentum. The vision blurred. The energy flattened. It became something functional instead of exceptional, and I realized that was the real consequence. Not collapse but mediocrity. The slow, quiet cost of removing the person who cared most deeply about getting it right. My mom reached out again months later. Not about the business this time. About family. About missing me. About how things weren't the same. I listened. I didn't argue. I didn't reopen old wounds. I just told her I needed distance. That love without respect was something I could no longer accept, she cried. I stayed calm. Not because I didn't feel it, but because I finally knew what my boundaries were worth. My sister never reached out directly. I think part of her understood that any conversation would require accountability she wasn't ready to face. Or maybe she simply didn't know who she was without the borrowed authority. I stopped trying to figure it out. Her journey wasn't mine to resolve. The more I built, the clearer my perspective became. I saw how often people confuse access with entitlement. How easily they justify taking from the person who gives the most because that person appears strong enough to survive it. I had been that person. Reliable, capable, quietly absorbent of chaos, and I had paid the price for it. But I also saw something else: how resilience compounds, how experience, even when it comes wrapped in betrayal, sharpens you if you let it. I made better decisions now. I trusted my instincts without over-explaining them. I chose collaborators who valued contribution over control. I noticed red flags earlier and acted on them instead of rationalizing them away. Success returned, slowly and then all at once. Not in the flashy way it had before, but in a grounded, undeniable way. Clients stayed. Partners respected boundaries. Growth came with stability instead of stress. And when people asked how I built it, I told them the truth, by learning what not to give away again. There were moments of grief I didn't expect. Not for the business I lost, but for the family I thought I had. Accepting that some relationships only survive as long as you are useful is a hard truth to swallow. But once you do, it frees you from chasing affection that was never unconditional. I forgave them, eventually. Not in a ceremonial way, not with conversations or closure. I forgave them by releasing the expectation that they would ever fully understand the damage they caused. Forgiveness, for me, wasn't reconciliation. It was relief. Looking back now, the title of my story makes people focus on the money, the timeline, the drama of it all. But that's not what stays with me. What stays with me is the transformation. The shift from needing validation to trusting myself. From building for approval to building for alignment. From silence that hurt to silence that healed. They came crawling back because they lost something they didn't respect until it was gone. I didn't go back because I found something they never had in the first place. My independence. My clarity. My self-respect. And once you build from that foundation, nothing anyone takes from you can ever truly be stolen again.